So let me start my brief presentations. There will be only 10 slides, so will not take more than 10 minutes, I guess, so that we will have plenty of time for the discussion and sharing of experiences among the participants, and then I can also handle some of the questions if there are any at the end of the presentation. So I am glad to be with the presenter. Next presenter is from the National College of School Leadership. So a lot of experience regarding the leadership development, school leadership development from the next presentation as well. So let me briefly present some of the notions, shifting notion of leadership first, from the positional notion where one particular person holding one position, taking the leadership role in charge, to uh, collective activity, group process. So thus we can see some sort of shift in the notion of leadership. From leadership as generic, leader could be a leader in every situation, every context, to a context specific or situational leadership, where the situation or the context has a lot of influence in the leadership process and the practices. Third point, it is from leading from the front, providing clear guidance. Some people call it assertive or strong leadership, to enabling or empowering kind of leadership where leaders try to empower the people. And finally, the next one is from transactional to the transformational side, where the first one, the transactional, is more on using reward and punishment resources to influence the people so as to achieve the results. From that perspective, to transformational, where empowering the people to achieve the results they all deserve and they all aspire for. So these are some of the shifting notions in the general concept of leadership. Let me move to the next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Yes, I think due to the delay in the connections.
Okay, it's all right. So let me move to the concept of school leadership then. First, I touched upon the leadership in general. This slide is more on the leadership in the school context. There are literature we can find which talks about the schools make a difference. Our life chances, our potentials, the development of all the potential people have is largely influenced by the schools we join actually. So this is very, very important for the development of personality. Depends on which school you choose to. That makes a lot of difference in your life chances. That's what people believe on. Number one. The second one is for making the schools effective. Some schools are effective in terms of achieving the results they aspire for, they try to achieve. Some schools are more effective than others. That is the results we have seen in many different international contexts. That is not only the case of Nepal. Everywhere you can see, with the same resources, with the same inputs available, results are not the same. Results are different. So for these different kind of results, differences in effectiveness of schools, there are different factors very much influential, very much powerful in influencing the results, and head teachers or the school principals or the leadership is considered as very much important factor for determining the results of schools, and it is often cited as the second to the teacher factor. But generally what the leaders or the school principals do is they try to influence the results through the teacher colleagues, through influencing the processes, school processes. So basically they try to mediate. There are some mediating factors. They influence those factors and then influence the results at the end. That is what researchers have shown in many different contexts. So this has drawn a lot of attention on principal factor, the school heads, in school effectiveness literature internationally. Next. Next, please. Okay, thank you. Talking about the instructional leadership, there are different aspects or dimensions of instructional leadership. The instructional leadership is basically emerged as a different notion in the field of school leadership, basically to focus more on the instructional side. I have cited one example from Hellinger and Murphy, 1985, talked about the three dimensions of instructional leadership: defining school mission, managing educational programs, and promoting a positive school learning climate. Basically, it is a shift in terms of giving more focus on the curriculum, supervision, teacher development, monitoring student progress, and creating a positive school learning climate so that the teachers in the school, the colleagues in the school can give their best in developing the students basically. So these are some of the very important development in the 1980s in the US and internationally as well. Instructional leadership is kind of variant in the field of education in the school management, school leadership that focuses more on the instructional sides of the leadership. Okay, next. Continuing with this, there is one more references from Robinson et al. 2008. There are 5 different dimensions of instructional leadership: establishing goals and expectations, sharing, developing common goals, sharing the expectations among the people, among the group, among the team, strategic resourcing. Resources available are always in the very much limited resources available, and then achieving the best out of the given resource is very much important. And the leadership role is providing strategic resourcing to the schools where the resources are most that gives the best results. So planning, coordinating and evaluating teaching and the curriculum, promoting and participating in teacher training, teacher learning, ensuring an orderly supportive environment. So these are some of the important dimensions of instructional leadership that has been cited in different cases. I have given one example, please. Now I will move to the next part of my presentation where I will talk more on the Nepal's case. This is the final slide on the conceptual part. It is more on the distributed instructional leadership, which talks about principal is not the single person that makes the difference. It is collective responsibility. It is concerted action. It is shared leadership among the people in the school. So the role of the teachers is equally important. For example, giving feedback or the supervision role in many of the schools, big schools, there are middle managers like the division or department heads or the in charges that take role in terms of facilitating the teachers and developing teachers, supervising teachers. So it is not only the principal that is leading the school in all the affairs. It actually guides, coordinates, creates atmosphere for the collaborative action among the people in the school, particularly the school level, for example, the department heads or the teachers or the students. It is because even the students' role is very much important in learning, in their own learning, because it is not that we do something to them, we do something with them actually. For that purpose, the role of students is equally important in the learning process. So it is the shared leadership among the people, teachers, department heads, and the students and the members in the community and the stakeholders as well. This is very much important. Next, please. Next. Okay. In this slide, I now move to the next phase of my presentation. I'll talk about more on the Nepal's experience, Nepal's cases. For example, in the Education Act and regulations, there is a provision, separate provision for the school head, the head teacher. It is basically a senior teacher with some additional responsibility. For example, Education Act 2028, in number 2, under the definition section, it says that teacher is a person who teaches, and that includes the head teacher as well. So the head teacher is a kind of a person with some additional responsibility in the school. That is what the Education Act has defined the head teacher. So the roles are very much important. ASD is the member secretary of the school management committee. So very much important in terms of the management process. When we talk about the selection of the head teacher, uh, there is one regulation provision in the education regulation that talks about the you know need for submitting school development proposal. Based on the proposal submitted by the potential candidate to become a head teacher, the head teachers will get appointed. And basically, it is a contract between the head teacher and the district education officer previously with the head teacher for a period of 5 years with the possibility of renewal. That is what is the provision in the education regulation. However, most of the schools have the head teachers appointed by the school management committee based on their seniority in the school, not through the open or the kind of competition among the candidates. Generally, it is estimated that only one fifth, 20% of the total schools have head teachers appointed through this kind of provision. Otherwise, in most of the cases, head teachers are appointed based on the just seniority in the schools. That is what how we have the selection of head teachers. Next, please. Roles and responsibilities under the Education Regulation 94, there are 931 different roles given, and most of the roles described in the Education Regulation are on the more on the administrative nature, and very few of them are instructional in nature. For example, there are some roles given to the head teacher in terms of teacher appraisal or teacher appointment, but mostly provisioning the resources, monitoring, or the creating appropriate atmosphere in the school, or the some other roles that are more on the administrative side. Moreover, a teacher acts as the member secretary of the school-based teacher selection committee. There is one teacher selection committee under the regulation 96 core, which which has given the head teacher a role as member secretary in the teacher selection committee, which impacts in some way the influence potential of the head teacher to the school staff. Let me move to the next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the development of the teachers, it is unlike the case of the UK, where we will hear more on the next presentation from the National College of School Leadership in UK. In our case, we have one head teacher development program, capacity of the head teacher development program conducted through the provincial level education training centers. It is a 1 month long training course divided into two phases. Phase 1, 15 days, and phase 2, 15 days again. So these kind of training programs have four major objectives. One of them is developing skills and competencies in instructional leadership. So the leadership and instructional leadership are integral component of the head teacher training program conducted at the provincial level. Now, this has got some special significance. There are some other objectives as well, as you can see in the slide. There are four, and one of them, and the major one, is on the instructional leadership. Please, next, please. Uh, Influence of head teachers in school decisions. They can bring people. Actually, there are some important areas where head teachers can make very important contribution or the influence among the teacher staff. In the instructional matters, for example, there are many schools with very small in size. For example, 43%, almost 43% of the schools in Nepal have less than 100 students. Most of these schools are primary schools. Most of them are from the rural, remote areas. So these schools have got only, less than 100 students, very small schools. So in such a case, there is no need for the middle level managers. The head teachers and few other teacher colleagues will work together, and then the head teacher has a very direct link to all the teachers and the students, works very closely with the colleagues in the school system. So in terms of influencing in the instructional matter, the head teacher is very much visible, but the role in supervision in curriculum and teacher development, as seen in many different research reports, is not that significant. So the general coordination role is visible. However, in terms of providing supervision or the teacher development or influencing in curriculum implementation is not that significant in many of the small schools in Nepal. However, since there is no middle layer, the head teacher talks directly with the teachers, so the connection is very good. Okay, so some of the issues: not a separate position, one position, actually additional responsibility for the head teachers. So this is important issue that constrains the development of the head teacher as well, because the person is a teacher basically with some additional responsibility. Two, the authority is not, if you compare with many other countries, maybe not that not adequate in terms of influencing the decisions in the school, because the head teacher has to work with the school management committee, has to work with the local palika, local governments, and has to work with many other educational personnel. So the role or the influence potential of the head teacher constrained by all these conditions imposed on the head teachers. Number three is development side. There are some programs for the head teacher development, short-term training courses, 1 month training course. Basically, these courses are useful in orienting head teachers about their roles, fine. But in terms of developing the leadership potential, I think there is a need for the extension in scope and also reorientation of the whole program for school leadership development. Because since leadership has very significant influence in the school results, so the development of the leadership has to be given very high priority, and that is not the case so far. So the teacher selection, teacher development are some of the very important areas that should get high priority in the future. I think I have covered the notion of leadership, school leadership, and then the practices and provisions in Nepal as well. So I will conclude my presentation now with this slide. I will be with you for any further questions or queries at the end. So that there are some of the references given at the end. So thank you for very much for this opportunity and opportunity. I will be with you for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them at our chat box, which we will be addressing at the end of the session. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Jane to begin her session. Dr. Jane, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to join you all at this symposium. I'm delighted to be here. Could I have the next slide, please? I've been asked to talk to you about my experience of instructional leadership in England. And I'm going to do this by, first of all, looking at where we've come from, what's our journey in leadership been like in this country, and then to share with you some of the practice in instructional leadership over the last decade. Thirdly, to think about what has stimulated change, what has encouraged school leaders to make the change, to be more focused on instructional leadership, and then to finish with just some very brief examples of practice across England. Next slide, please. I just thought it was worth quickly showing you this. When you look at the research literature, instructional leadership, which, as we know already, comes from America, comes from the USA, the literature shows instructional leadership in different types of descriptions. So, for example, the leadership of teaching and learning. And my view would be, let's not get hung up about the title of these things, as long as we're all clear about what things mean and what we're talking about. In the UK, we favour the expression, the leadership of teaching and learning. Thank you. Next slide, please. OECD 2016 summarised instructional leadership in the following way. And that its view is that instructional leadership focuses on the principle. We could agree or disagree with that. But I think the second statement they've got there about including the wider school leadership is really very, very important. As we've heard already from previous speakers, it's not just what the head teacher or principal does. It's what leaders right across the school engage in. Thank you. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in England, what do school leaders focus on in relation to their activity when they're engaged in instructional leadership? And we've seen a similar slide already from Dr. Talashi, where he shared some definitions from research. And just so to pick up on that, I'd just like to pick out the middle bullet there, if I could, and say a little bit more about that. The practice of leading and managing the teaching program is absolutely critical to instructional leadership. So the kinds of things like monitoring, observing teaching, the scrutiny of pupils' students' work, maybe going on a learning walk around the school, the analysis of student data, not just summative data, but also formative data, so that as a school leader, you clearly understand where the students in your school are in terms of their progress, is very, very important. And that the last bullet point here picks up some of the points that Susan Douglas was making earlier, the research from Vivian Robinson. Instructional leaders clearly have a focus on the professional development of teaching and learning. So they're clearly all the time wanting their teaching staff to develop and improve the quality of the work that they do so that student outcomes get better. The statement at the bottom of the slide, I think sums it up really nicely for me. This is a piece of research done by McKinsey in 2010, where they looked at 8 high-performing systems across the world. And then what they did is they took the top 5% school principals in those systems and looked at what they did. And what they found was that these principals devote about 80% of their time to improving the quality of teaching and learning. And I think that's a really significant finding for us to keep hold of. Next slide, please.
Hi, June. So sorry to interrupt. It seems like all our participants aren't able to view the slides. So I'm just going to try and reshare the slides with hopes that they'll be able to see them again. So apologies for that. Let me just reshare.
That's okay. No problem.
Okay, sorry about that. I hope it's showing the slide where we stopped at. Please do continue, Jane.
Thank you once again. But that's fine, yes. And all colleagues can now see the slides? Yeah, we're okay with that? Shall I carry on?
Yes.
Okay. When we're thinking about the development of leadership in our schools, it's sometimes useful to kind of think about what journey have people made. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, you can see the characteristics of school leadership in the 70s and 80s, so 1970s, 1980s. in England and into the early 1990s. And at the time I was in the early 1990s, I was doing my PhD and I was looking at the changing role of the secondary head teacher. And one of the things I found was from all of the interviews that I did, that there was a strong focus on management, a strong focus on administration, and less focus on what in my research is called leading professional, but for that you can say instructional leadership. So thinking about the quality of teaching and learning in your school. If you go to the right hand side, you now see what the current situation is in England. And just taking that top bullet point, there has been a significant political, professional, public and moral drive to try to raise outcomes for all students in all of our schools. And that clearly gets people thinking about how can we do this. And head teachers now have a lot more autonomy than they had in the 80s. And they can therefore make decisions about what goes on in their own schools. Just going to the bottom bullet very quickly. We have a system of, as I'm sure you do, of operational and strategic planning that is clearly based on evidence that is gathered from school self-evaluation activities. So what's going on in our classrooms? You know, what's the evidence we can collect that will tell us what we're doing really well and what we need to improve on? Next slide, please. So picking up from the themes from Dr. Talashi and Susan Douglas earlier, leadership roles across the school has been very, very important to ensuring that instructional leadership works effectively, particularly as at this middle leadership level. So subject leaders, heads of department, heads of faculty, heads of year. And in England, they have strong teaching and learning responsibilities that allow them to monitor what is going on in their own areas. And they're much better placed if they're specialists in maths, for example, to make judgments about the quality of mathematics teaching than, say, the head teacher would be, whose specialism might be, say, in geography. So that's been a really important development in our country over the last 15 years. And the third point there, collaboration. Schools are much more open now than they used to be. So collaboration within schools and across schools. So observation of one another's lessons, planning lessons together, exchanging practice. All of this encouraged by instructional leaders. Next slide, please. So what has encouraged people to change? Change occurs automatically, but actually what you can do is you can put drivers in the system to push the system in the way that you want it to go. And on the left-hand side, these have been some of the key drivers that have got head teachers much more focused on the leadership of teaching and learning, more focused on instructional leadership. I just take the first one there. We've had national standards for head teachers in England since 1997, and we've had various, iterations of those, various versions. They've developed over the years, but every version has emphasised the importance of the head teacher in leading, teaching and learning. Going to the other side of the slide, those drivers, if you like, have been supported by professional development, which is now strongly focused on improving teaching, and national qualifications. We have 3 qualifications that were developed by the National College for School Leadership, one for middle leaders, one for senior leaders and one for aspiring head teachers. And all 3 qualifications have what we call a compulsory module. So everybody has to study that module. And the modules are about the leadership of teaching and learning. Because clearly the leadership of teaching and learning at middle leadership level is different from headship level. So that's had a strong impact on people's views in schools. I just want to say a couple of words about research. With a lot of school-based research going on now across our schools in England, and people are asking the question, what works best? How can we best improve outcomes for children and young people? And now let's use that evidence to support further improvements. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we come on to a later slide. Next slide, please. I think it's always important to ask the question, well, okay, does this actually make a difference? Instructional leadership, we know from McKinsey's research, we know from Ken Leithwood's work, we know from the OECD that highly effective leadership always has an element of instructional leadership in it, and that makes a difference to the outcomes in a school. But what I've tried to do here, colleagues, is sort of demonstrate that in relation to some test results. But there is a big caution here, which I'll come on to in a minute. So this slide shows you the test outcomes for 11-year-olds and the test outcomes for 16-year-olds in English schools over a period of 25 years. And you can see they've improved. But here comes my huge health warning. These are different tests, different children. We know that our equity gap is widening, particularly with the COVID situation we've had where children have been out of schools. And we also know there is a number of factors that influence outcomes, not just instructional leadership. But we can see here that the trend is certainly upwards. Next slide, please. So thinking about the skills that these school leaders in the UK have developed, and we've heard already from Dr. Tulashi and from Susan Douglas about the importance of distributing leadership across the school, involving others, drawing on others' expertise, clearly modelling behaviours. If as an instructional leader you think that the leadership of teaching and learning is important, then show that in your own behaviour. Visit classrooms, talk about teaching and learning. 40 years ago, if you went into a staff room during, say, the lunch break, the dinner break, you would rarely hear a conversation about teaching and learning. Now those conversations are going on across the school. Observing, teaching and giving feedback, really important. Mentoring and coaching others, critical. If you want to grow leadership in your own school, if you want to encourage your middle leaders to take on instructional leadership responsibilities, mentoring and coaching them has been demonstrated to have a really positive impact. And I've said already about the importance of analysis of data, so being really, really clear about what the school is doing well and where it needs to improve. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just very quickly on the next 2 slides, some examples. Now, again, a health warning. Context is critical. We can't transfer practice automatically from one context to another because contexts are very, very different. But we can learn by looking at what other people do and asking ourselves the question, what is this telling me about my own practice and what can I learn from this that I might be able to use? So a schools partnership programme across England, where schools work together collaboratively, supporting one another's development and instructional leadership. Education Endowment Foundation, school-based research onto interventions and their impact. And it's just worth having a look at that teaching and learning toolkit, because the interventions are analysed in relation to the cost of them, the time that is spent on them, and the outcomes they produce. So I've left those two website addresses for you if you wanted to have a look later on. Next slide, please. And these are just two schools that I know, and I chose these because in early 2000s I visited Outward Grange when it was a single school, and I visited the Flying Trust Academy when it was a single school, Candleby Lane Primary School just outside Nottingham. And both of those head teachers, the whole of the time I was in their schools, talked to me about nothing else but the leadership of teaching and learning. That's all they wanted to talk to me about, which was terrific. Now both of those organisations have expanded into what we call academy trusts, with, as you can see from the slide, a significant number of schools being part of that trust. Outward Grange, they have their own institute or training and development centre, where they offer a wide variety of activities for both teachers and leaders to develop their instructional leadership skills. And my final slide, please. So just in summary, we know from all today's presentations that instructional leadership can make a positive difference to student outcomes. And we also know that leaders at different levels of the school can effectively contribute to those instructional leadership activities. And finally, what helps with all of that is a collaborative culture where whole staff are engaged in and committed to improving student outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. That was a very insightful session indeed. So now we have come to the question and answers section. We have picked up a few questions, and we have the first one for Dr. Tulsi sir. So this question was actually from our social media platform by Gunraj, who asks, how can we develop master trainers for training the head teachers across the country so that we won't have to rely on mainstream experts, and that we can explore local resources and pedagogies addressing the local realities? So
I think this is very important challenge for the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology to develop trainers at the regional, provincial levels. This is very much important. We do have training centers at the provincial level, and at the same time, we need to have very much competent human resource available at the provincial level training centers so that we can have their service available at the time we need. So we need to develop a pool of trainers at the provincial level so that they can provide the training at the time when they are in operation. I think this is very much important agenda. Preparing trainers first. Yes, I agree with you.
thank you, sir. And we have a next one by Nandan Shrestha, who asks, who comments that it seems head teachers in government and private schools in Nepal are required to be very knowledgeable. So now, how can that trait be developed with all the provisions provided?
If I understood the question correctly, it is about mixing the head teachers from the public school and the private schools at the same point. There are some opportunities for bringing the head teachers from different types of schools at the same place in the training provisions. Otherwise, in terms of managing the schools in these two different set of school systems, the questions are not the same. For example, in the public school system, the resources are almost guaranteed by the government, whereas in the private school system, they need to rely mostly on the resources from the parents. So the issues and challenges for these two different sets of school systems are not the same. They can learn from each other, yes, but then the provisions, the resources available with the government for the training purposes is mainly limited to the public schools. That is why most of the training courses from the government are available only for the schools heads from the public systems only. That is the case. Otherwise, they can learn from each other. Yes, I agree on that.
Yes, yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Next question to Dr. Jain. So during this pandemic, our participant Jay Krishna Mahajan would like to know what kind of activities should head teachers and teachers engage in, and also he'd like to know what the basic requirements are for a head teacher in the UK.
I assume I'll take the second part first, if I may, because I assume that means to be appointed to a headship. The appointments are made by governing bodies, and clearly governing bodies will be looking for head teachers who can demonstrate in their previous roles they've actually made a difference in the schools that they've worked in. So they'll be looking for evidence of that. And they'll also be looking for evidence that the head teacher who is being interviewed, because it's open selection, advertised openly across the country, the head teachers, the potential head teachers they're interviewing are the right fit for their school. And this links back to what I was saying earlier about context. They'll be wanting to make sure they select a head teacher who has demonstrated a positive track record for school improvement, and who is the kind of person who can continue to make their school the best it can be, so will fit well into that context. In terms of what's been happening here with COVID, schools have started back in September. From March right through to September, schools were closed. There was a strong focus on providing virtual learning opportunities for pupils and students. The schools were open for essential workers' children, but not other children. The head teachers and teachers kept going just as you are today through, and technology has demonstrated to us over this last 6 months how wonderful it is for us to keep connected and to keep on learning, even though we can't meet in the same room. So head teachers and teachers in England have used the same strategies that you're using, online conferencing, connection with the local school down the road through using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever. They have tried very hard to keep connected to each other and to keep on learning.
Thank you, thank you. That's very good to hear. Thank you. So we have our next question from Mr. Tirtha Karel to Dr. Tulsi sir. So he asks that because our head teachers, they have to spend most of the time in administrative and infrastructural sites and other tasks. So how can we make them more responsible as the educational instructor and academic leaders?
Thank you, Tirthaji. Again, it is the question of instructional leadership. I think the challenge is to empowering the head teachers themselves. The head teachers want to, and then they try hard to improve the instructional processes in the school. But maybe in many cases, the head teachers need some extra support in terms of developing their competencies in supporting their fellow teachers. So the question is more on the development of the capacity, competency of their teachers for empowering them, and then so that they can practice more on the instructional side rather than on limiting themselves only on the administrative side. So the question is more on the capacity and competence of the teacher. That's what I think.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We have time to take.
Can I just
Yes,
add
yes,
a small comment to that? Because I agree with all of that, but a general comment about change. All of us find it really, really hard to change our daily habits. You know, if we've been working in a particular way over a particular period of time, doing things differently is a challenge for all of us. I don't have a solution to that challenge except to know it's hard. But just because it's hard, we doesn't mean to say we shouldn't keep on trying.
thank you, Dr. Jane. I'm afraid we have now come to the end of the Q&A session due to time constraint. However, we have noted all the other questions that have been posted on the chat box, and this will be addressed by our other speakers as we move along for this event later on during the week. So I'd like to now end the session. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you to Dr. Tulsi Sir for the insightful session, and also to Dr. Jane for being with us to provide the UK perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you have any other questions on school leadership, please feel free to log into our Facebook page and send your questions using the hashtag Education Symposium 2020 and tag NP British at NP British. You can ask your question on Facebook or Twitter. We will make sure to continue picking them up and asking our speakers throughout the week. Please do log into our other sessions as well. Thank you all once again, and we will see you during the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to you.